There we go. All right, so today's webinar is one of a number being offered by the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center during 2018. This National Technical Assistance Center was launched back in 2016, and it is funded with support from the Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Students. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend school every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. Next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit of information about the two communities of practice, these are referred to in the center's mission, and they're focused on the 30 national My Brother's Keeper Success Mentor sites and the many SIG and SIG-eligible schools throughout the country that are working to implement early warning systems programs to address chronic absenteeism. Although we have run into several unanticipated delays in launching the formal technical assistance website, we are pleased to announce that we are in the process of building the site out now, and we anticipate that the site will go live early this spring, so we will obviously make a national announcement when that happens and be sure to get you all access to that site to have access to that resource and information. So today's webinar is being presented by Sue Fothergill of Attendance Works. Sue facilitates Attendance Works network to advance state attendance policy and practice, a network of more than 100 organizations from 31 states and the District of Columbia. Ms. Fothergill is also responsible for technical assistance at the local and state level and coordinating Attendance Works policy work at the federal and state level. And they're also a partner of the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. So Sue, at this point, I will go ahead and pass things over to you, and when you are ready to receive some questions, just let me know and I'll read them out.
Great, thank you so much, Veronica, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. The key learning objectives will be covering content that will help identify frameworks and strategies to support students with disabilities through mentoring. Our guest panelists will cover the critical mentoring framework, how the National Disabilities Mentoring Coalition supports disability-specific mentoring models and programs, mentoring programs that have been customized to meet the needs of students with disabilities, how mentors can advocate for their mentees through the 504 and IEP processes, the principles of universal design, and closing out with resources that will assist you in implementing inclusive mentoring programs and practices. Next slide. I'm going to take just a few minutes to do a brief reminder for all of us, especially those who might be new to the conversation, about some of our basic chronic absence frameworks and ideas. So one thing to be very familiar with is the definition of chronic absence. So chronic absence is the collective numbers of days missed for any reason, whether students are missing school for excused absences, unexcused absences, or suspension, when those days add up to a student missing 10% or more of their days on roll. So if a student is on roll for 10 days and they miss one of those, then that student is at risk for chronic absence. Next slide. We also know that chronic absence can sometimes go unnoticed because the absences add up over time. Many schools and school districts across the country have systems set up to flag when students miss several days in a row. Schools and school districts are moving toward being able to monitor absences that are sporadic in nature but cumulative in their relationship to academic outcomes for young people. Next slide. We thought it was incredibly important to host this particular topic on the relationship between mentor, the opportunity to support young people, and specifically students with disabilities. The data show that students with disabilities are disproportionately more likely to be chronically absent, and in some cases, 50% more likely to be chronically absent. We hope through this webinar we can identify appropriate resources and strategies to engage young people with disabilities into the mentoring strategy and then appropriately design those mentoring strategies to meet their needs. Next slide. Some of the contributing factors to higher rates of absenteeism among students with disabilities include lack of availability of instructional supports in their classrooms or their after-school programs, disproportionate lack of access to programs such as art, music, gym, and extracurricular activities that keep young people engaged and interested in being in school, the failure to meet specific health and behavioral health needs of students with disabilities, the inability or failure to provide appropriate transportation services, sometimes including transportation services to after-school opportunities or other engagement strategies, no access to quality after-school programs, and then the impact of disability and race bias on young people. Next slide. The consequences of chronic absenteeism began at a very early age. We know that young people coming into kindergarten who are chronically absent in preschool are less likely to be ready for kindergarten. The milestones go on from there. When students are chronically absent in the early grades, they're less likely to be able to read at grade level by third grade. And we also know that students who cannot read at grade level by the end of third grade are 4 times more likely than proficient readers to drop out of high school. And by middle and high school, chronic absence is a better predictor of student disengagement and dropout than test scores. Next slide. We also know we're at a watershed moment in our country. The shift from No Child Left Behind to the Every Student Succeeds Act has created an opportunity for every state to define, at the state level with federal parameters, the measures by which they will hold schools accountable. States were invited to create a school quality index for their schools to measure accountability, and 36 states chose a measure of attendance. 27 of those states chose chronic absence specifically as a measure of school quality and student success for their schools. Many more states, while not including chronic absence specifically as a measure of accountability, are looking at chronic absence as a measure to be utilized in their school improvement process, and all 50 states are required to collect, monitor, and report chronic absence on their state data report cards and also to the federal government through their EdFact submission. Next slide. With the importance of chronic absence as it relates to youth outcomes and the disproportionate nature and impact that it has on students with disabilities, we are pleased to be able to bring to you this panel of experts that will share with you specific ideas, strategies, and resources to help you implement programs in your schools and districts to support students with disabilities being fully supported through the mentoring strategy. Derek Shields is the co-chair of the National Disability Mentoring Coalition, which focuses on strengthening the awareness, quality, and impact of mentoring for individuals with disabilities. At ForwardWorks Consulting, Derek provides disability inclusion training and technical assistance for employers and supports the World Institute on Disability Career Access Initiative. Mary Roberts, Program Coordinator with Urban Alliance, is working for a Baltimore nonprofit that helps to employ and mentor high school seniors. Previously, she served as an AmeriCorps Vista, supporting over 25 of Baltimore's out-of-school time programs in their efforts to serve students of all abilities. She has also worked with children and young adults for 10 years as an educator in general and special education settings. Janelle Thomas, Director of National Initiatives, Partners for Youth with Disabilities. She is passionate about empowering organizations to become inclusive environments that support youth of all abilities to reach their full potential. She has authored and co-authored Best Practices for Mentoring Youth with Disabilities, National Implications for Mentoring Youth with Disabilities, and Expanding Access and Inclusion for Youth with Disabilities, an Inclusion Guide for America's Youth Programs. She is the co-chair of the Leadership and Mentoring Task Force for the Global Partnerships for Children with Disabilities. Delia Hagan will also be joining us, the Program Director of Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. Delia is a licensed certified social worker serving as the Director of Programs at Mentor. In this role, Delia supports the development of the National Mentoring Resource Center, a comprehensive online resource hub for the mentoring field. Delia also manages national programmatic initiatives, including mentor trainings and technical assistance efforts for Mentor's National My Brother Keeper Success Mentors Partnership. Thank you all for joining us panelists. We appreciate your being here today, and we're going to begin with Derek. Next slide, please. Derek, I'd like to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much, Sue, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining this important topic today. Sue gave me a great introduction. The short version is I'm Derek Shields, and I'm the co-chair of the National Disability Mentoring Coalition. And I'm thrilled to be invited by Sue and team to discuss today mentoring as a disability inclusion strategy. Next slide. So what we have here is an amazing opportunity in front of us. As we know from Mentor, 1 in 3 youth grow up without a mentor. What we also know from the disability community perspective is that youth with disabilities in our country grow up with extremely low employment expectations. And therefore, the influencers around them don't necessarily support inclusive participation in academics to drive towards employment. And then once employment occurs, we know that retention and advancements challenges are greater for people with disabilities than they are for those without disabilities. And importantly, we know in mentoring that we don't want to create isolating environments. And for the disability sector, this is critically important. In fact, it's so important that when we talk about a watershed moment, for people with disabilities that are in school today, these students with disabilities, this is their moment. This is the time that the fork is in the road. And we, in the mentoring community, can either find a path that will be one of inclusion and that will drive towards a lifetime of opportunity, participation, and belonging, or for that student with a disability, the other path that they could take is a path towards benefit and poverty. The National Disability Mentoring Coalition was created to help more students with disabilities take the path towards opportunity. Next slide, please. When we look at this unifying moment, if we have a watershed moment, I think we could say upon that in the mentoring community, we have a unifying moment. And it's one that we could look at through the lens of critical mentoring. For those of you that are familiar, Dr. Tori Wieston-Cerdan has a book called Critical Mentoring. I love this book. Any book that's under 100 pages is right up to the top for me. Tori reimagines mentoring to shift to doing work that is participatory, emancipatory, and transformative. And in the model, she looks at these 4 components: critical race theory, youth-centric, and importantly for us, intersectionality. And when doing this, community-centered and culturally relevant data. But it's this point around intersectionality that matters. And let's compare this to our mentoring community work. So are we doing siloed work, or are we doing fully inclusive mentoring? And if we look at intersectionality, then we'll better understand, are we truly building pipelines with inclusion? And in this examination, we should challenge each other that are we bringing disability justice into the fold, and are we providing mentoring programs together as an inclusive community? Next slide. So if you're not familiar with intersectionality or critical mentoring, the term was first used back in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was a civil rights activist, or is, and a scholar of critical race theory back from the 60s. And this is really important when it comes to the disability community, because let's all be clear here that disability rights are civil rights, and that critical race theory is connected to the civil rights movement. And intersectionality describes how gender, race, and class, and importantly, other factors play a role in oppression. So the other factors, as you can imagine, for a student with a disability are those disabilities, whether they're physical and known or invisible or hidden, non-apparent disabilities, not known, right? So the oppression can come from different identities. Intersectionality, of course, allows people to understand one another on a broader spectrum, and it helps people find common ground with others. So let's use this concept of breaking the silos through intersectionality to get to really one's whole identity. Next slide, please. So on this slide, it talks to this notion of having different identities, and that intersectionality and disability really are hand in glove. So it provides information for folks to make sense of who they are and want to be. And in the disability community, perhaps you're familiar with these terms, but there's different movements. Like the People First movement, instead of saying that person's disabled, you would say person with a disability. But there are people with disabilities that have an identity first, like I'm autistic. And they're confident and proud of this identity. And these folks are in school today, and they're being raised as disability rights activists, and they're confident in carrying that identity first. And so this blended approach of identity says, well, I can bring my whole self to my community. I can bring my whole self to school, and one day, hopefully, my whole self to work. So keep these ideas in mind when we're speaking and talking about building inclusive mentoring. Next slide. If you're not interested in ordering and reading Tori's book, I'll give you a shortcut. Tori provided a one-hour webinar for the National Disability Mentoring Coalition members back in June 2017. It's on our YouTube page, so you can find that out at YouTube, Disability Mentors, and it's fully captioned, and it tells the whole story about critical mentoring, intersectionality, and the intersection of disability. And what she gets at in the webinar is the destruction of ableism. And this is our unifying moment. If we can put our ableist, unconscious bias aside and be willing to acknowledge and identify disability first, we will in fact start to reach not just a quarter of our student population, but upwards of half of the student population. And when we're talking about if attendance is critical to the success of the student, then we're talking about if we're not doing this, we're missing out on potentially half of the population. Next slide. As I mentioned, I'm with the National Disability Mentoring Coalition. Sue told you our mission. We're about awareness, quality, and impact of mentoring for youth and adults with disabilities in the nation. And we do that through 4 areas. I'm going to hit home on a couple. Connections and resources first. Next slide. The National Disability Mentoring Coalition is just over 3 years old, and we came together to increase really the dialogue around bringing these silos and mentoring together. We do that with the support of Mentor, and appreciate Dalia inviting me to participate. And also, we do this closely with Partners for Youth with Disabilities, and Janelle will be speaking shortly. On this screen, we have about 50 logos of organizations, and the key here is that you don't need to remember all these organizations. What you need to remember is if you do not have confidence in mentoring youth with disabilities or mentoring students with disabilities, to know that there are organizations available across the country in your backyard that will help, that there are natural partners in the work, and that these models for mentoring vary greatly. We have school-based programs and community-based programs. We have electronic mentoring programs. We have programs for youth on the autism spectrum. We have programs for blind youth. We have programs for deaf youth. There is a program for every community. So if you're wanting to step forward and create a partnership, we offer you connection to our community. And if you're not sure about how to take that first step, then please contact me directly and I'll provide that introduction. Next slide. One way to get involved, which kind of demystifies the experience if you want to start but you're not sure where, the American Association of People with Disabilities houses something called Disability Mentoring Day. This is in October, the 3rd Wednesday in October normally, but it could be done any time of year. And it's a great opportunity to in effect, have a job shadowing or shadow experience for youth with disabilities in a safe, single experience. For the partnering organizations, such as a school district and a mentoring program and an employer, it importantly has the byproduct of creating leadership and partnership amongst the different entities to then tap into throughout the rest of the year. You can learn more about that at aapd.com. Next slide. There are some other organizations out there. For example, the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. They provide mentorship for individuals who acquire paralysis. They're across the country. So if you have an individual who is in your program and is uncertain and needs a peer mentor, somebody else living with paralysis, this is a great model for an individual who acquires paralysis. Next slide. And importantly, when we look at the school students, so the significant portion of our population is diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, those in themselves, ADHD isn't necessarily a learning disability. It actually can rise to a level of an intellectual disability. However, learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities combined form a significant percentage of our student population. There are organizations that exist, such as Eye to Eye National, or in this case, Broad Futures, which is a Washington, D.C.-based internship program. What we like to see is connection between local mentoring programs and internships and with embedded mentoring. In this case, Broad Futures finds students that are dropping out and delivers a holistic curriculum that drives their confidence, embeds a peer mentor who has succeeded in graduating high school and moving towards college. And this model's been in place for 3 years. You can learn more about these types of programs at our website, disabilitymentors.org, or with Broad Futures case at broadfutures.org. Now, these were just 3 examples of some of the programs that exist in communities and across the country. Next slide. When you think about across the country and inclusion and mentoring, certainly we think of Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, growing affiliations and supporting projects like Success Mentors and My Brother's Keeper initiative. We work closely, Mentoring Coalition, with Mentor to bridge our communities and ensure that youth with disabilities that are in school or community-based programs are finding mentors with disabilities or inclusive mentoring experiences. We appreciate that partnership. You can find youth with disability services through the Mentoring Connector, and we appreciate their support there. Next slide. So as the title of the presentation says, mentoring is a disability inclusion strategy. Inclusion as a subset of diversity inclusion has been a field that's burgeoning professionals across the country. But rarely do we use mentoring as a disability inclusion strategy. And that's our mission. We're trying to change this to reach our population when they're younger, to divert them into a pipeline towards opportunity. So at our website, we have a white paper we published last fall that summarizes the current state of disability mentoring, identifies research that shows the impact of disability mentoring when positive influencers come into the life of a youth with a disability, that they are more likely to graduate high school and go to college, and in turn graduate from college. But let's remember, 62% of college students with disabilities never work. So all of us have to be committed to change that in this lifetime. Let's not punt this to the next generation, but work collectively to put a pipeline of students with disabilities toward opportunity, not poverty. Next slide. A lot of the tools that we've created as a mentoring coalition are in 2 locations, one on disabilitymentors.org and another on a toolkit we created with the Department of Agriculture. The website is on the slide, and you can get tools and resources to find programs across the country, but also to manage flash mentoring events for students with disabilities. Next slide. As I've said a few times, disabilitymentors.org is our homepage. This slide shows a few resources on here. If you're interested in joining us, you can apply there. We have a mailing list. You can get a full list of our 54 members, one of which I'll take mention of right now. The National Council on Independent Living has 405 centers for independent living across the country. You can access those resources in your community. There's a Center for Independent Living in every state, and one of their mission areas is peer counseling, and they can work with you to ensure a peer mentor for a student with a disability to complement your program. You can also access our calendar there along with our white paper. Next slide, please. So this wraps up my section. I'll just say in summary, this is our defining moment to bridge together justice movements, and this one will bring in the disability community for disability justice. It also is a chance to leverage intersectionality to ensure that our participants bring their whole identity to school and to our communities. And importantly, we have much to learn from you all, and I look forward to partnering with you as we move forward together. At this point, I'll send it back to Sue.
So, Derek, I just want to say thank you so much. There were a couple of terms that you shared today that I just really valued. So this idea of not just sort of creating mentoring strategies that are fully inclusive, but using mentoring as a strategy for inclusion, I think is such a powerful insight and sort of flips on its head this idea of how we approach this work, and then the opportunity for a unifying moment. So thank you so much. Veronica, I had a couple of questions that were posted to me directly. Do you have some questions to share as well?
I don't see anything that came in through the Q&A, so please go ahead and proceed with the ones that you received, Sue.
Okay, and then also, folks, if you, I had a little bit of trouble posting the Q&A, but I was able to post a chat. So feel free, if you are having a similar experience, to post any questions that you have to the chat, and you can direct them to the participants list or to Veronica directly, and you can choose her name through the drop-down box. Derek, we have two questions that were sent to me. One question is, how many students do you believe with disabilities might benefit from having a mentor who don't currently have one? Do you have any idea about the disproportionality that might exist in the mentoring practice currently?
Thanks for the question. I've seen a couple numbers out there, but I'd hesitate to actually use a number. What we don't know is how many aren't disclosing their disability. We do know how many, and this is cool because this is where we bridge to next. We know how many participate with the 504 or an IEP, and then we could look at that population and compare it to identification inside of mentoring programs and draw a correlation. By and large, students with disabilities don't feel safe with disclosure at the same rates as other identities. So we know that, and we also know that they sometimes want to participate, but what they're seeking isn't just a mentor, but they're seeking at times a mentor with a disability. So there's a few challenges there. But in general, this is Derek talking as a person here, there are millions of kids with disabilities that don't have mentors in our country, and they don't have pathways to them. I was a product of junior achievement growing up, and I don't remember one kid in those sectors, in that experience, that had a visible disability. And you know, so now it's 40 years, and we've made a lot of progress, but I'm afraid that we continue to duplicate the same problem of isolation. And so if we can intentionally start talking about it, then we will intentionally find students that we can identify through their influencers, like parents and teachers.
I think that's a perfect segue to Ms. Mary Roberts, who has worked and dedicated years of effort here in Baltimore to help to open up opportunities to students with disabilities and create inclusive programming. So Mary, I'm going to shift to you, and I'm really excited for you to pick up here. I think that it's a perfect segue to what you'll be talking about.
Thank you. Yes, so again, my name is Mary Roberts, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share with you all some strategies and points to consider in helping to advocate in the processes of the 504 plan and IEP, or Individualized Education Plan, to help improve school day attendance. Next slide, please. All right, so to begin with, I'd like to start by defining a few terms. First, the IEP, or Individualized Education Plan, is a blueprint providing individualized special education or instruction and related services to help meet the unique needs of the student. The 504 plan is also a kind of blueprint. It's a little different. It's mainly for providing accommodations, and I'll speak up more a little bit about accommodations a little later, but for providing accommodations in the learning environment to help meet the needs of a student who has a disability, such as a mental health disability, a mobility impairment, or ADHD, but academically they don't require special education. They can learn with accommodations to the general education curriculum. A student's IEP or 504 plan is developed each year and can be revised at any time. The IEP includes many things such as the student's disability, the present levels of performance, and measurable goals and objectives. Next slide, please. So now to accommodations and modifications. So for the purposes of today, I'll focus on the accommodations and modifications that are included in many plans, primarily because they must be provided to the student during the school day, and they're very relevant to mentoring and any other out-of-school time programs. For some examples of these include preferential seating, so that's or altering seating arrangement. This could also look like having students who are usually overstimulated seated in the front of the class as opposed to the back, or that they're seated further away from a window, for example, to avoid distraction. It could also mean rearranging the desks so that there's a passable aisle available for students who might use a wheelchair. Accommodations can also be frequent breaks, access to quiet, safe space as needed, audiobooks, access to assistive technology to assist with learning, or extra time to complete tasks or process information. And so for modifications, examples of those are maybe fewer test items, giving some students shorter reading selections or alternative assessments. And an example of alternative assessment would be accepting test answers verbally instead of in a written form, for example. And when we think in terms of physical activities, modifications could be requiring fewer laps if you're doing a physical activity such as sports, or fewer rounds. Or, for example, in the game of tennis, one might allow a student to perhaps, a student who doesn't perhaps move as quickly to have a few more bounces before they have to return the ball. So that's generally kind of a simple example of modifications for physical activities. Next slide, please. Okay, so if mentors are to properly support students who've been formally identified as having a disability, it's really important to decide whether a student or protege would benefit from their participation in the IEP and 504 meetings. If you sense, as a mentor, if you sense that your protege or the student needs more support during the school day than they're getting, or if the protege is expressing concerns, you may want to be part of the team meetings when they determine the proper supports he or she needs. So mentors can attend these meetings if the parent asks them to be present. Sometimes school staff or the students themselves might ask the mentor or another professional to come in and attend the meetings. It's important for the parent or guardian to give consent for the mentor to be present, to share and obtain that critical and confidential information. So definitely parental acceptance is needed. Okay, so the accommodations and modifications included in the IEP or 504 plan can help mentors better understand how the protege learns, how they process information, and how they communicate best. Mentors can incorporate these practices into their way of working with the student. It is recommended that each mentoring and out-of-school time or OST program consider including a release of information form in their enrollment materials that will allow the mentor to receive a copy of the IEP or 504 plan. This consent form must be explained clearly, and by that I mean that them signing the release form is voluntary, and it's not a condition for participation in that particular program. That has to be made very clear, because there are, some might tend to be a little hesitant to participate if they don't understand that. And with this, the mentor can learn from teachers and other team members and the parent or caregiver how the student learns best. Next slide, please. All right, so if you are in fact able to take part in an IEP or 504 plan meeting, these, what you see now, these are some guiding questions to help facilitate a meaningful discussion in the areas of, for example, school environment, instruction, home environment, social development, and health issues. So these are a really good reference to kind of use going into an IEP or 504 plan meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, so it will be critical to identify any barriers to the students or the protege's attendance and inclusion that may be negatively affecting their school day or after-school experience. So step one of that is for mentors to learn skills to identify the barriers. And then two, of course, is planning strategies to address and hopefully resolve those barriers. The following are a few possible solutions to common barriers. So for example, if a student lacks organization, say for instance, a student has been diagnosed with ADHD, a way to get around that barrier is to maybe establish a check-in routine or to find homework or to organize papers. If a protege has difficulty entering or negotiating a crowded, noisy space, like a school building or a hallway, the classroom or cafeteria, any one of those places, perhaps scheduling having an adjusted schedule would be beneficial, or allowing the student possibly to have a peer accompany them to pass through those hallways or those spaces. If a protege is feeling socially isolated, one solution could be to pair them with a buddy to help them foster social inclusion amongst other students his or her own age. And finally, if a class does not seem relevant to a student, that could be a barrier that a student doesn't see the class as relevant or the material is relevant. Perhaps the mentor can work with the IEP team to improve the content by highlighting real-world situations in which aspects of the curriculum would be used to pursue the career or life skill identified in the transition plan in that IEP. And for those who might not know, a transition plan describes the supports a student with an IEP needs to make the transition from secondary to post-secondary activities. Next slide, please. All right, so what's great about some IEP and 504 plan meetings or even a team meeting outside of that process is inclusion of youth voice and self-advocacy. It's expected that a student of any ability would be able to express themselves and have critical input into how to best meet the various goals. In both my personal experience and in studies that, you know, are very popular, it's very clear that inclusive programs make youth voice a real priority. So youth voice looks like, for example, offering student surveys on their experiences to kind of get a feel of how they are received by the program, incorporating a student-led advisory committee, or including them in a leadership role in their IEP or 504 plan meeting. These are strategies that contribute to the development of leadership skills. It empowers the student by giving them a sense of ownership, which tends to actually decrease unwanted behaviors. And overall, with the input from the student, the program becomes more effective. So for the sake of time, we will not play the video now. It's about 3 minutes long. But at a later time, please, I welcome you to view the video with through the link provided. And so the video was created as part of the Baltimore Attendance Project, featuring Matt, a high school student with a severe learning disability who had missed approximately 100 days of school for 2 consecutive years before his aunt and uncle brought him to a legal advocate. So the advocacy resulted in the school district agreeing to update his assessments. Based on those new reports, the team developed a new IEP and identified instructional supports and assistive technology to facilitate learning and class participation. So one of the great things about it, which you'll see in the video, is that when Matt directed his own IEP, he became more accountable for his attendance and participation, and at the end of it all, you'll learn that Matt graduated from high school successfully. Next slide, please. All right, so some mentors, administrators, or after-school programs may wonder, what if the students we work with don't have IEPs, or haven't been diagnosed, or don't necessarily have a disability? This is the beauty of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. It's a method that benefits all students or participants in a program regardless of their ability. UDL is a set of tools and techniques that are implemented to create an environment in which virtually people of all ability levels can participate. So what does that look like in a mentoring or after-school program? That would mean that students have regular opportunities to give and receive communication in various learning styles. For example, visually, kinesthetic learning or auditory learning. In addition to youth voice, which I just spoke about, models of self-regulation are built into the program. An example of that would be students knowing that they can use a retreat space when they are overstimulated or become frustrated, or thinking about visual aids. For example, if you're presenting to or with proteges or students that might have a disability or that you suspect might or might not, having those visual aids available with various adjustments, or thinking about the noise level in a particular environment for those who have challenges with hearing. So at the end of it all, it's really about removing barriers in anticipation of serving everyone. And also on this slide, I'd like to just touch briefly on person-first language, because that's also important when we're discussing universally designed programs. So person-first language is important when creating a program that is truly supportive of students with disabilities. It's a way of speaking of or to someone with a disability by acknowledging his or her humanity before the disability itself. For example, mentors should use the phrase student with a disability instead of disabled student, or student who uses a wheelchair instead of wheelchair-bound student. So language does matter, and person-first language is a vital part of building that inclusive, universally designed program. Next slide, please. Okay, so as mentors are supporting students with disabilities, and as administrators are building and supporting the program itself, they should do so with the confidence that participation in after-school or out-of-school time programs increases school engagement, as we've previously said. It improves attendance and participation. So students' increased school day success could be affected by how inclusive extracurricular activities are in after-school programs. Included in the resource slides, which you'll see, you'll see reference the Together Beyond the School Day. Although it was written in the Baltimore Out of School Time Inclusion Project, which is a project that I worked on as an AmeriCorps Vista, the information contained in that booklet is relevant to all the programs in the U.S., and mentors might benefit from the helpline concept used in the Baltimore Out of School Time Project. And using the helpline, mentors can connect with local disability experts for coaching and guidance. Next slide, please. Okay. All right, so these, again, are resources that come from, I mentioned Together Beyond the School Day. There are also some resources that were created by Disability Rights Maryland, which is an advocacy nonprofit in Maryland that helps actually students and adults gain access to benefits. And I believe that's it. Next slide, please. Okay. All right, so here is my contact information. Please, if you have any questions about student advocacy in the IEP or 504 plan process, I will be happy to answer any of your questions, or perhaps redirect you to anyone who might have knowledge in that particular area.
Thank you so much, Mary. I really appreciate all the points you made. I can absolutely see how addressing the factors that you highlighted, whether they're organizational challenges or barriers around how a student might be perceiving or experiencing their physical environment, how all of those different moments can inhibit a student in being able to fully participate in school or fully participate in a program. And so taking those environmental and personal factors into consideration and developing a design that is inclusive of all youth is an inspiring story to share. And I want to thank you, Mary. And I also want to encourage folks on the call to absolutely click the link and learn about Matt and his experience and his own his self-advocacy and overcoming the challenges that he was experiencing, and his excitement that people wanted to work with him, to support him, and encourage him to be the decision maker and the problem solver around the challenges he was experiencing. It absolutely changed his life in a way that is inspirational. So please do check that out. Veronica, do we have any questions for Mary before we move on to Janelle and our final panelist?
Hi, Sue. Yes, we had one question come in, and it says, hello, Ms. Roberts. Do your parents use 504 plans as an excuse to miss days of school?
I can't say that I've experienced that. Well, just so I guess I'm clear on kind of what I'm bringing here. My experience is that I taught for about 10 years in various school systems, and so I'm kind of coming up at it from that aspect as a special educator for some years and as a general educator for some years. But I never experienced parents using the 504 plan as an excuse to miss school. In my experience, a lot of parents did mostly, wanted the children to be in school, but perhaps they were aware that they were aware of some of the challenges that perhaps their diagnosis or disability brought to the table. And so in an instance where the parent might feel that their child's disability is hindering them from attending school on a regular basis, that's where asking all those very important questions comes in during the IEP or 504 plan meeting.
Mary, can you talk a little bit about how an IEP plan or a 504 plan might help to support attendance or remove barriers to attendance?
Sure. So as I mentioned a little while ago, when you're or when anyone is sitting down in a 504 plan or IEP meeting, one of the things that is discussed is, what's going during the school day. What are, how does the student's diagnosis affect, what's going on inside the classroom? And you can get into a number of things, like I listed the school environment, the health issues, all those sorts of things. So when you're in that meeting, what should be happening is that those very important questions should be asked, and hopefully everyone who has relevant input into those answering those questions is there to provide that information. And in so doing that, you can address attendance. So for example, if attendance is an issue, then you begin to ask those questions. What is going on inside the school environment? Is it, for example, that they're being bullied? Is it, for example, that the student feels like the material is that they can't access the material? Or is it that they don't have significant relationships with school staff? So you kind of want to work your way through those questions and ask, what is it? What are the possibilities as to the barriers that might be there? And again, self-advocacy and youth voice are very important in that aspect too, because you can kind of sit in a meeting all day and speculate, which, is great. You should ask those questions, but it's also great to also have the student there to speak up and give straight answers as to why they might not be attending school. So it's definitely, I think, a matter of asking those questions and having the appropriate people in those meetings to help answer the questions who know and interact with the youth on a regular basis.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Mary. We'll now turn to our final panelist of this afternoon's webinar. Janelle, can I invite you to join us?
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today, and it's always humbling to be the last presenter after several strong and experienced people go before you. So I will do my best to round out some of the edges from their presentation and fill in any blanks that we saw. It's really exciting having the different perspectives from the panelists, and so that you know my perspective. If you could switch to the next slide, please. So I'm Janelle, as was discussed, and I'm the Director of National Initiatives for Partners for Youth with Disabilities. And I started my career early on with a focus on youth development, particularly youth with behavioral and mental health challenges. And so I did that for a number of years, and then moved into an environment where I was involved in working with students with all types of disabilities. And now my role at PYD, you'll hear me refer to my organization as PYD, now my role is to travel and work with organizations around the country related to their inclusion practices. And so hopefully I can share with you some of what I have learned over the last 20 years, particularly what I'm seeing work really well in terms of youth development and mentoring. So next slide, please. So for the purpose of my time with you, we're going to talk about a handful of things. Briefly, we're going to touch on understanding disability. I know many of you have experience in this area, and both Mary and Derek touched upon it, so we won't spend much time, but I do think some fundamental language is important. Talking about inclusion, just making sure that we're all approaching it from the same definition, and then offering 4 tips for inclusive mentoring. And these tips are helpful to staff and especially to the mentors that you're working with. And so it's really a transferable tips. And then resources and questions. So next slide, please. So we're going to specifically talk about understanding disability because what I found in my work is that often, you know, some disabilities are easy to see, as has been talked about before, and for those disabilities, self-disclosure doesn't always have to happen, but for other disabilities which are hidden, the self-disclosure process is really important, and it's also important to understand that sometimes what can be perceived as poor decision-making and bad behavior can be tied into a disability or an undiagnosed disability. So we want to talk about the language and the definition of disability so we're all working from the same page. So next slide, please. So when you're talking about disability, you're really talking about, this is the legal definition, a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activities. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that life activities can actually be, it's a huge, huge range. And some are things you're really familiar with, like, you know, sleeping or hearing or seeing, but others are more hidden, even talking about digestive issues or bowel or neurological, respiratory. And for the purpose of our time together here today, I'm going to talk about disability probably even more broadly than this, which, so this is the legal definition, but I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of anyone who identifies as having a disability, and even those who don't identify, but for whom others know that a disability exists. So we're going to talk in pretty much in a broad and general sense, because you never, as a mentor or a staff member, you don't necessarily know if the youth you're working with or the student you're working with has a disability. You might, as Mary talked about, from a 504 perspective, or students who are in special education, but there's many times that you may not know, either because a disability has been undiagnosed or for whatever other reason that might exist. And so we want to prepare practitioners and mentors to feel confident that no matter what identity or diagnosis the student has related to disability, that that they're ready and excited to work with that student. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual that I use a lot with mentors around the country, so that we know that some disabilities are hidden, they're non-apparent, and a lot of students with disabilities won't even identify as having a disability. They might say things like, you know, I have trouble concentrating, but maybe nobody's ever really used the word disability with them before. And then, as Derek mentioned, you have other students, both with hidden and non-hidden disabilities, both apparent and non-apparent disabilities, who might feel proud and have a sense of real identity related to their disability. So each student is different. Next slide, please. So related to the disability definition that we just talked about, and knowing that we may know a student's disability, we may not, we want to promote inclusion, both from the mentoring standpoint, but also just in terms of a student feeling included in the learning process. We know that the juvenile justice system has a high percentage of youth with disabilities represented, and the Department of Juvenile Justice is paying attention to that now, and they're saying if we're not acknowledging disability as part of the puzzle, then we're not paying attention to a really critical piece. And so by thinking about inclusion in the learning environment and in the community, we have a better opportunity to set these students up for success. Next slide, please. So the perspective from my experience is, you know, inclusion isn't a checklist. It's not a list of things that we should or shouldn't do, although there are some valuable shoulds and shouldn'ts, but inclusion is a proactive approach and a belief that every person, regardless of ability or background, can meaningfully participate in all aspects of life. And I highlighted meaningfully participate because it's not just about getting students to attend school, because you can be attending school and you could be putting your head on the desk and sleeping, or you could be attending school but you could be zoning out. And so we want students to be attending school and meaningfully participating, the way you heard Mary talking about the student who participated in their IEP process. We want meaningful participation so that students actually want to come to school. And so if you turn to the next slide, please. The quote that really frames all of the work that I do with organizations is by an attorney named Verna Myers, and it's diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. So I always ask, are the students you're working with dancing? Are they just sitting there? Are they bored? Are they, you know, ignoring the teacher? Or are they dancing? Are they engaged? Are they participating? And our goal is to get them to dance. Our goal is that we want them meaningfully participating, not only in school, but in life. And I'm going to share with you some tips to help mentors encourage that. Next slide, please. So the question of why be inclusive, if we go back to the definition of inclusion and that proactive approach, the reason to do that is what I had mentioned before, is we do not know always what a student's true background is, what they're struggling with, what their disability might be. We may know some of those things and we may not. And so by developing an inclusive approach, we are prepared, more prepared for all of our students, and then all of our students will be more successful, even those without disabilities. When we're taking the time to be proactive in our approach, proactive in our youth programs, proactive in our classrooms, everybody benefits. And so we're going to talk more about that, but the research is clear. When youth programs take a proactive approach, an inclusive approach, their outcomes improve. And so that should be really exciting to all of us as we think about being inclusive. You heard Mary talk a lot about accommodations and modifications, and certainly those are very important, key, critical pieces to making sure that youth with disabilities are able to access the classroom, access the learning environment, access the material. But even before we start talking about accommodations and modifications, we should be talking about setting up our environments to be more inclusive. So we're going to talk more about that. Next slide, please. So in my work with different organizations, particularly youth development organizations and those in the mentoring field, there are some key things I've noticed that are fundamental to working with youth with disabilities, and whether you're in a classroom or in a youth program. And we're going to talk about each of these a little more, but those four are be intentional about language use, and you heard Mary talk about that. Number two is understand the guidelines for universal design for learning, and Mary introduced this topic too, and I'm going to go a little more in depth on that. And then notice the way environments are structured and evaluate if the structure supports maximum engagement and meaning. And then lastly, learn about trauma and the impact it can have on learning and connecting. Next slide, please. So be intentional about language choices. So we hear a lot about, you know, the importance of words, the importance of language, and it is important. But what I want to highlight is it's less about our word choices. Our word choices are important, don't get me wrong, but it's more about the intent behind our words. And so what we want to impart with our language is always respect and dignity for that person. And so based on what you heard Derek and Mary talk about, identity first versus person first language, what you're going to want to do usually is use person first language initially, because that is the, I would like to call it a safer approach to put somebody's personhood first, unless that person tells you that they prefer to be identified another way. So an example is what Derek brought up is autism. Some people with autism have a strong identity tied to autism, and they don't want to be called a person with autism. They want to be called an autistic person. It's very similar in the deaf community, where it really is a culture and a community, and there's pride around that. So I think as we get to know students, we'll understand their comfort level around identity and the way in which they have relationship with disability, and that will help you with your language choices. Next slide, please. We often talk about disability etiquette or inclusive language and the work that we do at PYD, and you heard Mary talk a lot about this too, just the respecting of the youth voice and respecting of that individual. And so there's a few tips here about language use that I think are worth paying attention to. And I won't go over all of them due to the time crunch here, but I will just end on the last bullet. Do my word choices and approach reflect my intention to be respectful? I think most people who are mentoring or who are working in a classroom would say, of course, I want to be respectful. I mean, that's why I got into this field. But a lot of people that I work with say they have some anxiety about language. There's a lot of focus right now on being politically correct, and people are afraid to say the wrong thing. And again, if your focus is on being respectful instead of just having the perfect wording, it tends to allow us to all relax. There is a really fantastic guidebook that is available that you can download for free from the United Cerebral Palsy Association. And it's a disability etiquette guidebook, and it has photographs and really non-threatening language. And we give that to all of our mentors at PYD. I didn't mention we have about 300 mentors that work with our youth every year, and we make sure that they feel really comfortable around disability etiquette. And I would recommend downloading that. It's free, and it will not only talk about language, but it'll talk about tone and just physicality, how different nonverbal cues. And I'd recommend that to everybody. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide representing the person first versus identity first. We've already talked at length about this, so I won't spend much more time on this. Just that you should educate your mentors around this so that they feel comfortable around the language. Next slide, please. Okay, so you heard Mary introduce the topic of universal design for learning, and this is a really exciting topic because universal design for learning, you may have heard of universal design, and universal design is the reason we have curb cuts in our sidewalks, and it's the reason that our environments tend to now be built with different users in mind. So for instance, when you think about sidewalks and curb cuts, they were originally designed for people with using wheelchairs, but they're also helpful to those who are pushing a baby stroller or those who in a big city are rolling a suitcase to get to the airport. And that's just a really simplistic example of how universal design positively impacts everybody, not just the person using a wheelchair. And universal design for learning is the same idea, that if you design your classroom, your environment, your youth program, your relationship using universal design for learning, it's going to positively impact everyone around you. So let's have the next slide. So you probably, if you've been in education or youth development any length of time, you've seen this cartoon. It's a person who's giving a test, and there's a monkey and an elephant and a goldfish and a penguin, and it says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And of course, really, I think only the monkey is going to succeed at that. And a lot of times our classroom environments are designed in the same way, to expect everybody to express the knowledge that they've learned in the same way. And maybe even people on this call have experienced that. I certainly have. I was a strong student. I studied hard, but standardized tests were difficult for me. If you gave me a verbal exam or had me do a project, I could ace it, but put me in front of a paper and pencil multiple choice exam and I would freeze. And there's a lot of students who are struggling in that way because of our system. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at universal design for learning, there's three pieces that Mary originally introduced, and I'm just going to dig a little deeper since we have the time. We have multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action. So let's talk about engagement first. Everybody is different in what's going to excite them, what's going to make them feel interested in a topic area. And so when you're thinking of multiple means of engagement in a classroom or even in a relationship where you're mentoring a student, you want to tap into that learner's interests, challenge them, motivate them. Sometimes you hear about if you have a student, let's say, with autism, and sometimes students with autism have a hyper-focus on one type of thing. I knew a student once who could name everything to do with NASCAR. And so that teacher or that mentor would frame lessons or meetings around the topic of NASCAR. And so you could learn math, you could learn reading, you could learn social skills around that topic. And so when you're thinking of multiple means of engagement, it's about being flexible to the needs of your student to allow them to engage in the material or the lesson or the conversation based on their desires. And then when you're talking about multiple means of representation, that's talking about how you're sharing the information. So are you sharing the information as a video, and then also by writing on a chalkboard, and then also verbally stating it, and then maybe showing pictures? So if you're doing it in multiple ways, it's much more likely that somebody is going to connect with that information versus just one means of representation. So this webinar is even a good example. You have us verbally talking, you have the written text, and then you'll see some of us even are using graphs to showcase our material. So that's an example, but of course with children or even those in transition age, you can even get more creative. Multiple means of action and expression, this is the most exciting piece of it. It's, you know, letting young people showcase their knowledge in a way that works for them. That can't always be the case, especially in a classroom environment, but it certainly can be some of the time. You know, after a lesson, maybe instead of a test, you can do a project. You can videotape yourself doing a speech about what you've learned. There's so many, you know, interesting ways that students can share the information that they've learned now, especially now that technology is involved, that it's an exciting time in education. And it does mean more work for the teacher up front because, or the youth development person or even the mentor, depending on who's working, it means more work up front because you have to think. You have to ask yourself these hard questions, you know, what is going to allow me to have multiple means of engagement? But at the end of the day, you know your students are going to be more engaged and have stronger outcomes. And when you're talking about harder to engage students or those with chronic absences, this becomes even more critical. All right, next slide. Okay, this one is fun to think about the way environments are structured and consider if the structure supports maximum engagement. We all live in societies that are set up in certain ways, and some environments are set up in a way that foster engagement and some are not. And schools, I've seen schools that are set up with inclusion as the core defining element of their school, and I've seen schools set up where the special education students ride a separate bus, have class in a separate hallway, eat at a separate time, don't have access to lockers, and are so segregated that they rarely come into contact with students who are not in special education classrooms. And this is the case even with some youth programs and other parts of our society. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So
Janelle?
Yeah.
Hi, Janelle. This is Sue Fothergill. I just wanted to share with you, you have about 1.5 minutes, and so I want to make sure that you can make this point that's so incredibly important and then share your fourth tip, because we do have some questions for you and Derek, and I want to make space for that as well.
Okay, I'm going to be quick. I'm going
Thank
to,
you.
I'm going to skip this slide and move on to the next slide. So I want you to think about the different types of environments that you can see in a classroom, in a youth development setting, in society. And the main point here is you see the 4 diagrams. There's a time and place for many of these except for exclusion. There's never a time and place for exclusion, but there is a time and place for these others. The question is asking yourself, why is this environment set up this way? And is it set up for maximum engagement? And when you always ask that question, then you know that that is the right environment. If you don't ask the question, you're just assuming that that environment is okay for those students, and it may not be. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is, I can't speak to this. This is probably the most important thing I have to say is learning about trauma and its impact upon learning and connecting. Trauma impacts learning and connecting in ways we don't even understand fully. And there are ways to prepare yourself for that. Even if a youth with a disability doesn't come from a traumatic home environment, 80%, a minimum of 80% of youth with disabilities are bullied, 80%. And it's more if that disability is apparent to others, so if there's a facial deformity or they're using a wheelchair. So it's almost guaranteed that when you're working with a student with a disability, they have experienced or witnessed bullying, which in and of itself can be traumatic. I really encourage you to look up trauma-informed practice and do some reading so you can be prepared when you're working with students with disabilities. Next slide, please. These are some links to guidebooks, free guidebooks that you can download related to the topics I've discussed. There's also an inclusion self-assessment that you can take for free to assess your environment. And then I've also included our website. If there's anything else I can do for you, I hope you feel comfortable reaching out. I'm happy to be a resource. Thank you very much.
Janelle, thank you so much. And Veronica, would you bring forward the question for Janelle?
Sure, Janelle. The question I have that was submitted for you is, as a school, how can you ensure you are inclusive if you aren't aware of a student's abilities and limitations?
That's a great question. That's a great question and a real challenge for schools and any environment, really. But I would argue that if you are studying and learning and applying universal design for learning strategies, and you're looking at some of the tips related to inclusion, then you can begin to set up your environment in an inclusive way, which is not dependent on knowing a person's disability. It means you're prepared for any youth, and that's going to be good for all youth. So the next step, the first step is really setting up your environment to be inclusive. And then as you get to know the students and the parents and you're asking the right questions, like Mary talked about, then you can start putting in place accommodation modifications. But the first step is assessing the environment for an inclusive approach. And I'm, sad to say that many of our schools are not doing that. And you see the cost of that when you see the high dropout rate. And it's not the teachers. The teachers are doing the best that they can. It's the overall environment and structure of how that school is set up.
Thank you so much, Janelle. There's so much more to say about this topic, and I invite people to use the resources and the links to learn more. And I would like to invite Delia Hagan from Mentor to talk a bit about some of the resources that we have available for you here.
Oh, hi everybody. This is Delia Hagan from Mentor. We've been absolutely amazed by all of the amazing information that was shared on this webinar, and super grateful to our partners for sharing all of this. We just wanted to share a couple of quick resources with you. Most of these things have already been covered, but more as reminders. We really, really recommend everybody to check out Critical Mentoring, a Practical Guide by Tori Wieston-Serdon. As Derek said, it's just a great resource if you're going to be doing diversity and inclusion work, especially around all different types of identity for your young people, including youth who have a disability. We also encourage you to check out, as Janelle was sharing, the NMRC has reviewed best practices for mentoring youth with disabilities, which was created by Partners for Youth with Disabilities. So we definitely recommend that you take a look, and you'll be able to access these links once you receive the PowerPoint slide. We do have no-cost help available for any mentoring program based in a school that is looking to, launch a mentoring initiative around, working with students with a disability or just in general. So we encourage you to request some support through the NSA ESC, and to visit the webpage, as Veronica mentioned earlier, join the listserv so you can stay in touch with us about the different supports that are available. And then we wanted to mention the OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center, which has lots of other resources around mentoring. It's really a one-stop shop type of hub for all things mentoring, all things for mentoring practitioners, so check that out as well. And then finally, we've got a lot of resources around Success Mentors, which is a model that's been used through the NSA ESC, and so we hope you'll check those out as well on the MBK Success Mentors resource page on the Mentor website. And thanks everybody for including us. We really enjoyed the webinar.
All right. So Sue, did you have anything else to share before I wrap up?
Please wrap up.
Sure. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending today. We certainly hope that you found it helpful and informative. And just a reminder that this webinar and all of our previous webinar recordings are available on our temporary National PA Center website. And you'll see in the chat box that Janelle just posted the link to that website. So you can go there probably within the next 48 hours. We should be able to post the recording of this webinar. So please feel free to visit that within the next couple of days if you would like to download the slides or view the YouTube presentation. Also, just please keep an eye out for emails about future webinars and our website. Like I mentioned early on, hopefully we can get that website launched early this spring, and we'll make an announcement about that as soon as it happens. But with that, I definitely want to send a thank you out to all of our panelists today for an excellent presentation, and to our facilitators, Sue from Attendance Works, and to Delia from Mentor for talking a little bit about her resources. And we hope to see you all on a future webinar. Thank you very much.